I gave birth to my daughter in 2022. As new parent experience, my life to date completely changed, with new intense feelings of gratitude, happiness, love, and fear. Somehow, I began to see life differently, and it orbited around her and her well-being, with many new different questions coming up. Is she breathing while she's sleeping? What should be her first food? Should it be broccoli or carrots? What toy will stimulate her brain development the fastest? In short, I was very invested, perhaps even a bit too much. And as I returned to work at the University of Oxford, I felt a newly created responsibility. The stakes were suddenly higher. I wanted for myself to be a personal example for her that women can be anything they want. But even beyond the personal, I wanted what I do for work, which is research, to have a positive impact on her life and that of her generation. How can the research I do make a meaningful change in her life? I wondered what are the remaining barriers for women in the 21st century. In Western Europe, women legally have the same rights and freedoms that men do. The gap in educational attainment has closed, and women's labor market outcomes are catching up to men's. But even in the most progressive, egalitarian countries in the world, gender norms and gender stereotypes remain entrenched. And it is this legacy of gender norms and gender stereotypes that leads to the continuous presence of gender-based violence that is impacting women's rights and freedoms to this day. A woman is likeliest to experience violence at the hands of her partner, her previous or current partner. That means out of everyone in her life, the most dangerous person in a woman's life is her boyfriend, her husband, her partner. On average, about 22% of women experience violence, physical or sexual violence, throughout their lifetime in Europe today. This amounts to 85 million women living in Europe today that have experienced violence. Remember your school friends? On average, 1 out of 4 of them has experienced domestic abuse. What about your friends, your mom's friends, your work colleagues? 1 out of 4 of them might be experiencing violence today. And what about those little girls that you see playing around in the playground, chasing each other? If nothing changes, 1 out of 4 will experience violence in the future. And while we think that a domestic abuse victim and tend to stereotype as a woman with a black eye, domestic abuse is very broad and can include a range of different behaviors, such as psychological violence and controlling behavior. Examples of this include, for example, in humiliating a woman in public, getting angry for her for seeing a male friend, not allowing her to work outside of the home, having to ask permission to spend any money, or forbidding her from seeing her family or relatives. Do you remember in high school when your friend's boyfriend yelled at her when he saw her with a male friend outside of school? Or what about your mom's friend, the one who has to ask her husband for permission anytime she wants to spend money? These are all instances of psychological violence that go on underreported. And it is important to understand how broad domestic abuse can be to be able to recognize it. In fact, 43% of women in Europe today experience some form of psychological violence. This is almost 1 out of 2 women, 1 out of 2 women. When it came to my daughter, having a daughter, I realized these weren't just numbers anymore. These statistics could tell the story of her life. What if she became the statistic? What if she became the 1 out of 4? Instinctively, I wanted to protect her from everything around her, from falling on her head while playing in the playground, from crossing the street safely, from falling in love with the wrong man. But it should not be the responsibility on us, on our mothers, on our daughters, and on our friends to protect themselves. But we, as society, need to ensure that this domestic abuse doesn't happen and is not tolerated. With this in mind, my work gained a new purpose. If by analyzing millions of data points around Europe, I could give a voice to these women, so to prevent the future abuse from happening, this was important work to be done. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, sure, domestic abuse happens, but it happens not in my circles and not to my friends. It happens to certain types of people. But the first thing I would like you to take away from today is that this is not true. Domestic abuse is widespread across all parts of society. We tend to stereotype domestic abuse victims as weak, self-destructive, irrational women. But this is not true. Victims can be of any education, any income, and any religion. They're everywhere around us. And by continuously stereotyping victims in media and discourse, we might distance the women that are experiencing abuse but don't fit that narrow definition of what a domestic abuse victim is that society pushes on us. And the fact that you don't know about it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen in your circles, but just that you were not made aware of it. And this is very common, as it's only about 15 to 20% of cases that get reported to the police, and only about 5 or 10% of other cases that get reported elsewhere, such as hospitals. This still means that the vast majority of cases, 70%, go on unreported and are suffered in silence. Now, when it came to my daughter, even if there was the smallest chance of something happening to her, we were ready to go to far lengths to protect her from it. But now, I was learning that while girls of her generation in public would go on to become professors, PhD students, CEOs, and presidents, in private, at home, 1 out of 2 of them would suffer psychological violence, and 1 out of 4 of them would suffer physical violence. Why wasn't this talked about more often? I wondered. In the words of another researcher, domestic abuse and violence against women is the most pervasive yet least recognized human rights violation in the world. It is a profound health problem impacting women's physical health, but also eroding their self-esteem and energy. It also leads to a range of negative outcomes for the women, such as a loss of employment, mental health issues, a higher chance of substance and alcohol abuse, and chronic pain and physical disability. It has a deep, negative, and irreversible impact on a woman's life. After researching and using data on many, many different data sets of domestic abuse victims and hearing many different stories, I can tell you the stories of millions of women around Europe. I won't tell you one story here. The strength of numbers is allowing me to tell you the stories of millions of women, of different people. So first, why do I speak about our daughters and not our sons? Yes, men are also victims of domestic abuse, but to a lesser extent. Also, female victims tend to experience more repeated offenses, are likelier to get seriously injured and killed than male victims. Also, anything that we do as society to change and reduce domestic abuse is equally going to help male and female victims. The second thing that I would like you to take away from today is that even domestic abuse can be committed by even your amazing friends, really smart colleagues, and overall nice people. We tend to stereotype domestic abuse perpetrators as being bad, because obviously when you commit something bad, you must be bad. But research has shown, for example, that long periods of alcohol drinking can inhibit emotional and cognitive regulation that increase the likelihood of domestic abuse. Similarly, certain events, such as losing one's job or psychological stress, losing one's job or a football game, can lead to psychological stress that in turns to violence for some people. Now, this is not to justify their behavior, but for us to always remember to trust the victims when they do report domestic abuse. So what can we do? There are changes that we must make as a society, and we must ask our governments to make, and we should vote for them. And then there are the personal changes we can make today. Overall, there are 3 areas where society can improve to reduce domestic abuse offending and help victims. First, it needs to ensure a culture of reporting domestic abuse. This could, for example, include training additional officers or additional medical staff to observe domestic abuse cases. Also, we need to provide quality housing for victims that do need shelter upon leaving their partners. Finally, we need to make sure that there's no unfair treatment of victims that do report domestic abuse, whether legally or in practice, such as was the case of a woman in Croatia who lost her job upon reporting domestic abuse. Second, we need to find better and more innovative ways to reduce reoffending rates. Reoffending, repeated domestic abuse, is very common. For example, in Croatia, 1/3 of domestic abuse perpetrators that have a criminal conviction will go on to reoffend again. We need to introduce and have research on programs such as behavioral therapy and substance abuse treatments that can help reduce this reoffending. Third, we need to make sure that at every contact the victim has with the system, now whether that's the police, the social services, or courts, she's both trusted and supported. Research shows that having courts that specialize in domestic abuse can help victims feel supported and lead to less reoffending. And then there's the personal. But personal is political. Sexism sets the scene for male abusive behavior. How many times have we heard she was asking for it? And while people may say she was asking for it as a joke, what that really does is it directs the shame from the perpetrator to the victim. Unacceptable. We need to understand that nothing is really just a joke, and even jokes and funny remarks reinforce norms, and norms are sticky. It is our individual responsibility to react today and change for the future of our daughters. Are you a parent? Set the right example at home on what a partnership is and how to communicate. Teach your children from an early age what is not okay to do. Are you a friend? Be a listening ear in your friends group. Look out for changes in behavior. Don't make jokes that degrade women, and if someone else does, don't laugh. By addressing the individual, systematic, and social factors that lead and brew this culture of violence against women, we can break the cycle of violence and create a safer environment for the future of our daughters. Victims don't have a voice. Hear their whispers. Raise their voices. Thank you.